Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation. My name is Elizabeth Ivory and I'm chair of Northumberland Learning Connection, or NLC as it's known. Before we begin, I respectfully acknowledge that Northumberland County, where NLC is based, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Iroquois, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous peoples and is covered by the Williams Treaties. Tonight's event will look and sound a little different than our previous Zoom presentations. Terry O'Reilly, our speaker, and a few of the people who work with NLC have gathered here at the Loft Theatre in Cobourg. This is the first time that we've stepped outside the zone of 100% Zooming. We're testing some of the elements of what's now known as hybrid programming, where we invite our audience to join us at the same time, whether they are in person or online. On November 25th, we hope to have a live streaming process up and running so that those who would like to attend an NLC event in Cobourg can do so, while others can watch at home. We ask for your patience and your sense of humor while we work out the kinks tonight. I hope there are none. I'll now turn over the mic to a friend of NLC, Bob Hambley, who has known tonight's speaker for decades and will introduce him to you. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello, everybody. I'm Bob Hambley. It was around 30 years ago, the graphic design company that my wife and I had started got a call from this place called Pirate Radio, and they wanted us to help them rebrand their company. I can tell you we were certainly intrigued to learn more about these swashbucklers. Not only did we get to see behind the scenes of how radio advertising worked, we met Terry O'Reilly. Terry and his partners had created a friendly, inviting studio that put staff, the voice actors, and their clients immediately at ease. And I always looked forward to my visits to the energy-filled halls of Pirate Radio, flashing control panel lights behind sound studio glass walls, actors practicing aloud their lines in the stairwell, and sound effects boomed behind closed doors. But like a circus ringmaster, Terry kept things running smoothly and on time, and always with a big smile on his face. And over the years, working on different projects with Terry, I got to know him better. He has an unwavering sense of curiosity, a knack for bringing out the best of everyone, and he has a deep desire to understand people, what makes them tick, and what captures their attention. His numerous podcasts and his now 3 books are lessons in both popular culture and sociology. Terry is a good listener. He's a great ad man, and he's a superb storyteller. Sit back, relax. You're with Terry O'Reilly. Thank you, Bob.
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you, Bob, for that wonderful introduction. I just loved it. Bob and I and Barb, we've known each other for over 30 years. I think we actually started our companies almost the same year, right? So Hambley and Willie was new and Pirate Radio was new. And we had that wonderful meeting where we got together, and then Bob and Barb did all our branding for all our various companies and divisions for the next 30 years. And we absolutely loved every single thing they ever did. So it is wonderful to be here, by the way. This is the first book event that I'm doing for this book. So this is a wonderful thing for me. Here's what I'd like to do tonight. I want to tell you about why I wrote this book and what intrigued me about the subject matter. And then I want to read a very, very short chapter to you that kind of sums up what this book is all about. And then I want to tell you about a couple of other chapters. And then what I discovered through the writing of this book about how all these very different and disparate stories all have some connective tissue, and what I learned about failure and catastrophic failure, and how it could end up being the best thing that ever happened to you. And then if you want to have a chat, if you want to ask questions about the book or the radio show, whatever you would like, I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to disrobe. That's the first thing I always do when I speak, really. Thank you. Just a little titillation in the beginning. As you saw on that screen a few minutes ago, I work with a lot of celebrities over my career. Mostly always good experiences, a few bad ones, but mostly good. We can talk about that after too, if you like. One of the celebrities that I worked a lot with was Denny Doherty. Now, he was the lead singer of the Mamas and the Papas, if you may remember. So I did a lot of commercial work with Denny, and then I'm the world's biggest Beatle fan. So I did a 263 episode radio show about the Beatles that we would air every day, Monday to Friday for an entire year. And Denny voiced all of that for me. And one day between takes, I was talking to Denny about the biggest hits of the Mamas and the Papas. And I said, my favorite song is not California Dreaming, which most people choose, but it's I Saw Her Again, that song. And I said, and I actually have a favorite part of that song. It's when you start to sing, then you stop, and then you start again. And I want to play you that just in case. So, everybody knows that song, right? So it's this big. So you know that song, right? Written, just by the way, because Denny was having an affair with Michelle Phillips, John Phillips' wife. John found out and wrote that song and had Denny sing it to let him know that he knew he was having the affair. Little sidebar there. But there's the part of the song I want to play for you is that what I call my favorite part of the song. I'm just going to get close to it here. Hold on. You'll hear him sing and then stop and then sing. I saw her again. And Denny said to me, that was a mistake. And I said, really? He goes, I was going through the song. It was the final take. I came in at the wrong place. I stopped. Then I started where I should have come in. Then after I finished singing the song, I said to John Phillips, sorry about that mistake. We can edit that out. And John Phillips said, that's my favorite part of what you just sang. And that's why that little bit is in that song. They kept that mistake in that song. And when he told me that, I thought, isn't that interesting? And then we started talking about other mistakes in songs that were left in. For example, if you know the song Roxanne by the Police, at the very beginning of that song, you'll hear Sting laugh. And then he starts to sing. And the reason he laughs, because that song's not a funny song, is because he tripped on the piano on the way to the microphone. And they left it in the song, which is kind of a cool little story. And if you listen to that, it'll be your favorite part of that song. And I'm the world's biggest Beatle fan, of course. So this is something I'm sure most of you do not know. And you have to listen closely for this. But at the 2-minute and 53-second mark of Hey Jude, Paul drops the F-bomb. So he made a mistake in the singing of it. He said, effing hell, and they left it in. John Lennon loved it and left it in, but mixed it really low in the mix. But if you listen to the 2-minute and 53-second mark of that very famous song that probably gets the most airplay of almost any Beatles song, you will hear Paul drop the F-bomb. And Sun Records producer Sam Phillips, who of course discovered Elvis Presley, was recording a song called Time Has Made a Change by an artist named Jimmy DeBerry. And while he was recording the song, the microphone picked up the shrill sound of a telephone ringing in the outer office. And Sam Phillips left it in the song, left it in the recording. And when asked why he did that, he said, it just felt right. And I kind of agree with Sam Phillips on that kind of mistake. He said he chased something called perfect imperfection, and that mistakes in a great thing were better than perfection in a good thing. And I completely subscribe to that theory. And as a director of commercials, so in the 22 years I directed commercials, I think I did the count one day, I directed close to 14,000 commercials in those years. I would always choose the take that felt right, not the take that was perfect. And by that I mean, I would pick a take, maybe the timing was wrong, or an actor came in at the wrong time, or mispronounced a word, but if it made me laugh, because I was primarily a humor director, if it made me laugh, I kept it. So I rarely went for the perfect take. I went for the take that felt best. And that kind of eventually led to this book, in that I have always been insatiably curious about meaningful mistakes. Mistakes that may seem, and in almost every chapter in this book, they kind of seem small when they happened. And then there was a tsunami of consequences. And in many of the chapters in this book, somebody made a catastrophic career mistake where they lost their job, their credibility, their revenue, and sometimes their sanity. But it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to them. And I was fascinated by those kind of stories. And the second kind of mistake I chased for this book was when somebody made a tiny, almost insignificant mistake and didn't think twice about it, but that mistake ended up becoming a breakthrough of some kind. So that was really what, and the cover of this book I love, which was HarperCollins, which is, I don't know if our people at home can see it, but it says, my biggest mistake, but it's rubbed out and it says my best mistake. And that really sums up what this book is all about, is that mistakes can be incredible things in your life. I say in the book that even after a forest fire, green things start to sprout out of the ashes. There's a wonderful thing that can happen out of epic fails if you recalibrate your thinking and don't look at it like a catastrophe, but look at it as, where is the opportunity in this? So with that, may I read for you, if I may be so bold, a very short chapter that kind of sums up the book, I think, and it's the first chapter in the book. It's about the movie Jaws, and the subtitle is, "You're Gonna Need a Better Shark." When Steven Spielberg was given the green light to bring Peter Benchley's novel Jaws to the big screen, he was just 28 years old. He had made only one movie so far, titled The Sugarland Express. Prior to that, he had directed a few television shows like Night Gallery and Columbo, and had done a few made-for-TV movies. One of those TV movies, called Duel, was the dry run that would eventually land him Jaws. It was the story of a man being pursued by a mysterious and menacing 18-wheel tanker truck for no apparent reason. When Spielberg put himself up for the directing job for Jaws, he told the producers to watch Duel because it too was the story of someone being hunted by a powerful and mysterious force. Duel imparted other lessons to the young director. For instance, it contained a scene where Spielberg is mistakenly reflected in the glass of a phone booth. And as he later said in an interview on Inside the Actors Studio, when Duel was shown in Europe, where there were in fact 18 different instances of Spielberg being visible because of the change in aspect ratio for the theatrical release. So he was inadvertently in his movies. Live and learn. When planning Jaws, Spielberg rejected the idea of using miniatures and shooting in Hollywood water tanks. With youthful bravado, he insisted on creating a full-scale mechanical shark and shooting in the ocean. He wanted realism. He asked his production designer, Joe Alves, to design a fully operational animatronic shark. He explicitly wanted a full-scale 25-foot beast that could move and swim and attack like a real shark. He wanted the eyes to roll back, the gill slits to breathe, and the jaws to work. The request was unprecedented, even by Hollywood standards. Alvis began with the sketches of the shark based on Benchley's, the author of the original book's, descriptions. Then he sketched different actions the shark would have to perform in the storyline. Next, Alvis drew a schematic cross-section of the shark, showing the mechanics and pneumatic hoses required to manipulate the massive creation. When he approached special effects experts with his plan, they all said it couldn't be done. All except for one. His name was Robert Madden, and he was convinced he could build it. As it turned out, Madden couldn't build one shark to achieve everything Spielberg wanted, so he had to build 3 sharks. Each one had a steel skeleton, hydraulics to open and close its mouth, and air-powered mechanisms to make the various body parts move. One shark moved left to right, with its hidden left side exposing the vast array of hoses, wiring, and mechanics. One moved right to left with an open right side, and one fully skinned shark was attached to an adjustable arm on a 12-ton, 60-foot-long submersible steel trolley that moved back and forth on rails mounted on the seafloor. To achieve the realistic motion of a shark, the main model would require a barge and 14 operators to control all the moving parts via a set of 300-foot pneumatic hoses. It also required scuba divers to manipulate the other end of the shark, additional frogmen filming from underwater, and a second barge for the camera and the crew, all of which floated alongside Quint's hero boat called the Orca, named after the only natural enemy of the great white shark, by the way. Tests were done in freshwater tanks at Universal Studios. They were tricky but successful. Spielberg was optimistic. He nicknamed the 1.2-ton shark Bruce after his lawyer, Bruce Raymer. But unbeknownst to them all, they had already made a corrosive mistake. Martha's Vineyard was chosen as the filming location because even 12 miles out to sea, the average depth of the water is only 35 feet. When Bruce was first lowered into the ocean off the vineyard, it sunk straight to the bottom. But that wasn't the biggest issue. Almost immediately, the mechanics inside Bruce started to corrode, leaks spraying everywhere, and soon the pneumatic hoses were compromised. Although an animatronic shark was difficult to work at the best of times, Bruce became increasingly unresponsive. Then the team slowly realized their big mistake. No one had tested Bruce in salt water. That was an incredibly expensive mistake. The 3 Bruces had already had a combined cost of close to $250,000, a big bite out of the $3.5 million total production budget. An everyday Bruce malfunction delayed the shooting schedule and increased overages. As the problems kept mounting, the crew began quietly referring to the film as flaws. Spielberg was filming a movie about a great white shark that made an appearance on a majority of the script pages, and he didn't have years of experience to fall back on. But he knew it would easily take another month to rebuild a saline-proof shark, and his budget only allowed for 55 principal shooting days. He had 2 immediate thoughts. First, he needed a solution, and he needed one fast. Second, he feared his career as a filmmaker was over. But obstacles often generate astonishing waves of creativity. Spielberg, faced with a seemingly insurmountable problem, sat in his hotel room one night and asked himself this question: how would Hitchcock handle the situation? Then it came to him: what we can't see is the most frightening thing of all. So Spielberg began rewriting the script to employ invisible terror. And it's astounding to think that at that point in that hotel room, Spielberg is on location with all the crew, all the cast, no working script, and no shark. He decided to shoot many of the scenes from a shark's eye view and had his director of photography devise a platform that lowered the camera to water level. Skimming a giant dorsal fin and tail through the water, would easily suggest the awe-inspiring length of the shark. And when he added the scene with the yellow barrels, if you remember, they could imply the speed and power of the terrifying beast. The piece de resistance became showed up in the post-production stage, compliments of composer John Williams. His simple yet terrifying two-note motif would become the shark, intense in volume and tempo when the shark was approaching, diminishing as the shark swam away. Williams has described it as, quote, grinding away at you, just as a shark would, instinctual, relentless, unstoppable. It was an astonishing feat of sound and silence, with a heroic French horn counter melody, possibly representing the Ahab-like quest of Quint. Then there would be severing stillness. The only shark in many of the most memorable attack scenes was Williams' two-note masterpiece. Maybe the best example is the opening of the movie, the opening skinny dipping scene, when Chrissy is thrashed back and forth in a terrifying attack. The actress wore a harness attached to two different cables run through submerged 300-pound weights. One cable was pulled by 8 men on the beach, and the other was manned by Spielberg. The very first shark bite jerk down was done by Spielberg, and the subsequent sudden moves were the result of the back and forth pulling from both ends. According to the sound technician on the film, there was a miscalculation when both cables were yanked at the same time. The sudden cross tension broke some of the actress's ribs. She screamed, and when she did, she went underwater. According to the sound man, she started saying, please God, dear God. The water was rolling in her mouth, and the word God would come out sporadically. She was in agonizing pain. That moment, that very scream, is the scene you see in the film. Another toe-curling scene showed two fishermen trying to catch the shark to collect the bounty money when the dock they are standing on breaks away. Then it slowly turns the surge back towards them as they flail their way to shore. We never see the shark in either scene. No teeth, no fins, no lifeless black eyes. Yet the predator is absolutely vivid in our imaginations, all due to Williams' visceral score. It's hard to believe in hindsight, but the great white shark doesn't make a full appearance in the 2-hour film until the 1 hour and 20-minute mark. And get a load of this, it only had 4 minutes of actual screen time. Yet moviegoers saw the shark in their minds for 2 full hours. And probably for quite a few days after they got home. And many of us still see it in our minds 46 years later, when we're near the ocean. Even though it took 159 days to complete filming instead of the original 55, and the budget ballooned 100% to $7 million, Jaws was the first film in history to break $100 million at the box office. It became the highest grossing film of all time after just 78 days in theaters. It delivered a domestic gross of $260,798,000 and a worldwide haul of $470,600,000. The movie heralded the arrival of the summer blockbuster. It won 3 Academy Awards, including one for John Williams' original score. Jaws put the young Steven Spielberg on the map. It is on the American Film Institute's list of best films of all time. And the saltwater mistake is easily forgivable. Spielberg has said the failure of Bruce the Shark contributed at least $175 million to the box office take. So that story is really sums up what this book is about, because Steven Spielberg was really facing a catastrophic mistake in that moment. As I said, he had his crew and his cast and all the animatronics and 3 sharks, and he only had 55 days to shoot, and then everything went sideways on him. And in that moment, in the hotel room, that dark moment he had probably in the middle of the night, fretting. And then when he asked himself that one interesting question, what would Hitchcock do? The solution came to him. The solution to a very vexing problem suddenly appeared. Little interesting side note too, I mentioned in the book, at the end of the book, when John Williams played the two-note motif for the first time to Spielberg, Spielberg laughed because he didn't think he was serious. And how amazing was that two-note motif in that movie? So that's chapter 1 of my best mistake. I want to tell you about a couple of other chapters just to give you a little further taste. And the stories are just so interesting, the way people handle big problems. So one chapter is on the rock band The Who. So when The Who was starting out, they were just another rock band in England, when there were a lot of rock bands in England. Once the Beatles hit, then that whole world came alive in the UK. And The Who was yet another band. They kind of were more like the Stones than the Beatles, but they were trying to find their place in this world filled with rock bands. And they eventually landed a manager who said something very interesting to them. He said, you have to find your thing that separates you from other bands. He said, don't be the black sheep, because that's the Rolling Stones. They're the black sheep. And don't be the white sheep, because that's the Beatles. They're the good boys. He said, what you need to be is the red sheep. You need to find your red sheep thing that makes you stand out from the crowd. So that made The Who really think, that really stuck with them. What can we do that will be our thing, our defining thing that people come to see us for, that's different than every other band? So one of the things they tried to do was come up with a great name, which was The Who. They were just throwing names around one night, and they were, they wanted to call themselves The Hair, and they had a couple of other crazy names. And then someone said something, and Pete Townsend said, The Who? And they went, that's the name. And that's how they came up with The Who. Anyway, they were playing around London in various bars, and one bar called, I think the Railroad, it was called at the time, was a bar that they played a lot. They were brought back to that, so they knew that bar really well. And one night they got up on stage to play, and it was the usual crowd that, their fans in front of them, but the first row was a bunch of cute girls that they had never seen before. And something else was different that night. The stage had been rebuilt because I guess it was old and a little bit rickety, but it was built about 3 or 4 inches higher than the old stage. So somewhere in the middle of their show, Pete Townsend was doing his big, windmill guitar moves. And when he went to hit this big guitar thing, he poked his guitar right through the ceiling, and the neck of the guitar snapped right off. Because of that 4-inch difference, that's what happened. In that moment, a bunch of interesting things happened. The girls in the front row started to laugh at him and snigger. And so what Pete Townsend did in a split second, he made a decision. He pulled it out of the ceiling and then smashed his guitar to pieces on the stage to make it look as if sticking it through the ceiling was intentional. The next night they were playing, and when they got to the end of their show, Keith Moon, the drummer, kicked over his drums and destroyed them, and that was it. That became the thing The Who was known for, was destroying all of their instruments after every single performance. And that was the thing that made them their red sheep. That was their red sheep moment. All born of one mistake one night that Pete Townsend drove his guitar right through the ceiling and snapped it in half, and then decided in that moment to save face, so because the girls, he was humiliated in front of those girls, was to smash his guitar to pieces. And that became, of course, as I said, the defining aspect of The Who. To this day, people remember The Who for their smashed instruments. If you are a fashionista, you probably have heard of Steve Madden shoes, because Steve Madden is a big shoe designer, very successful shoe designer. He started a shoe company. He had a talent for designing interesting shoes. He made high fashion very affordable, so he was able to attract a very big range of shoppers, especially teens loved his shoes. He grew up in a family where his father had grown up during the Depression. His father was also an entrepreneur, a very small little company, but his father always fretted about money. because he saw everybody lose everything in a depression. So while Steve Madden was growing up in his family, his dad's conversation at the dinner table was always about losing everything, about losing money, how it could all disappear really quick. That was the constant predominating thought of his father, which eventually permeated Steve Madden's DNA. So when Steve Madden started his company, he was doing well. I think he was doing something like $500,000 a year in shoes. He had one store in Soho in New York. And then one day, and he always fretted he was going to lose everything. So he inherited that fear from his dad. One day, an old schoolmate of his knocked on his door and said, I am a co-founder of an investment firm called Stratton Oakmont. And what we do is bring small companies like yours to the public market. Like we create an IPO, put you on the stock market, and we will generate millions of dollars for your company. And Steve Madden said, well, my company is too small to be a public company. Like I only have one store. And this guy said, but that's what we specialize in, is small companies with a great story and a great product. He said, we can put out an IPO on your company. We can probably generate $6 or $7 million, and we can put $500,000 in your pocket. So Steve Madden, who is consumed with money, said, let's do it. The problem was, Stratton Oakmont sounds like a really respectable Wall Street firm. It was really a pump and dump joint in New Jersey, just using phone banks. So what this company would do is they would artificially inflate the price of a stock on the stock market. It's a complicated thing. I explain it in my book, but I'll give you the highlights. They put the stock out into the stock market. They artificially pump up the price within minutes to go from, like, say, $4 to $12. And the way they did that was they employed this, selectively recruited number of people called flippers. And these flippers would just keep selling the stock for Stratton Oakmont. And then they would sell all the stock back to the investment firm for a small little profit. But the firm would have, pumped up the price artificially. And then they would sell that stock to unsuspecting investors and then go on to the next thing. And then as soon as they left, the stock would drop like a stone, and people lost hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars every time Stratton Oakmont did this. They did it for Steve Madden's store. They did, in fact, earn $7 million on the IPO. They gave him $500,000 of that. He put it all into his company. He thought it was fantastic. He was able to grow his company with the $500,000. Then they recruited Steve Madden to be one of their flippers. So whenever they did this to another company, Steve Madden became one of those guys that just traded the stock really fast for a couple of minutes to artificially inflate the price, and then he would make a little bit of money. He did this 22 times for this pump and dump firm. Then, of course, the Security Commission caught on, and the two co-founders of Stratton Oakmont were put in jail. But they plea bargained their jail sentences. And the way they did that was by giving up the names of all their flippers. And so they gave up Steve Madden's name. So the two founders of this firm did 31 months in jail. Steve Madden got 41 months in jail. So he went from being this guy that was, a star on the fashion world with this great store and this great product to being in jail for 41 months. He was an interesting guy because he was a very volatile guy. He had a really hot temper. He would, if something wasn't going right, he'd pick up shoes and throw them across the room in his store. He had a cocaine and alcohol problem, but he was one of those guys that inside that whirling dervish of a lifestyle, he was able to create a great product. But then he goes to jail. And while he was in jail, he became a changed man. I mean, when he got out of jail, his personality had changed. He suddenly was very much more patient with people because he had no patience prior to going in. He realized the importance of time, and he realized his own limitations. So his net worth is estimated to reside in the $200 million neighborhood. He receives revenues from episodes his company creates in syndication, et cetera, t-shirts, merchandise. He has written and directed 3 motion pictures. They've earned millions of dollars at the box office. He has a gig on Comedy Central where he MCs various shows. He's a singer. He's recorded lushly orchestrated American Standard albums. He has received 2 Grammy nominations. He's sung at Royal Albert Hall in London, Carnegie Hall in New York. He won a prestigious Peabody Award, and on and on and on. Like an incredible Hollywood career. And none of it would have been possible had he not made a life-altering mistake in September of 2001. And in that month and in that year, he had gone back to his alma mater to give a speech in Rhode Island about, he had a small amount of success at that time. He went back to Rhode Island, gave a speech at his old college. And that night he went out with the faculty, and they all got drunk. And the next morning he was to fly back home to Los Angeles, and he was hungover and he slept in. And he raced to the airport, and he didn't get to the airport in time. He was 10 minutes late for his flight. So he decided to book a later flight. So he went and fell asleep in the lounge, and then he heard all this activity, and he woke up, and what was on television was 9/11. And the flight he missed was the flight flying from Boston to LA. It was the first plane that went into the tower. So that whole dynasty, that whole industry, that whole, incredible company and industry that he created, none of that would have happened had he not missed his flight by oversleeping and being hungover that morning. So quite an amazing story from an amazing guy. How's the time? Yeah, okay. Okay, great. So let me tell you one more story, and then we can have a chat. So I mentioned Sam Phillips earlier. He, of course, was the producer at Sun Records in Memphis. He's the guy that discovered Elvis Presley when Elvis Presley walked through the door. In 1950, he was recording B.B. King, was one of his artists. And B.B. King knew another band called Ike Turner and the Rhythm Kings. And B.B. King said to Ike Turner, "You should be recording. You guys are that good. You should be recording." And Ike Turner said, "I have no idea how that happens. I have no idea how one becomes recorded." And B.B. King said, "Well, I happen to know a guy in Memphis, and I'll call him up and I will have him record you guys." So he called up Sam Phillips, said, "This great band, you've really got to hear them. They're terrific." So Sam Phillips called up Ike Turner and said, "How quick can you get to Memphis?" And Ike Turner said, "We're already on the way." So they got into a car, and they piled the whole band got into a car, and they piled all their equipment into this car. They had drums tied to the roof. They had amplifiers tied to their guitars and everything in the trunk. And they tied an amplifier to the back of the trunk outside. I mean, you can imagine it was like this, this car that was just overloaded, flying down the highway, trying to get to Memphis to get to this great opportunity. As they were loading the car, the guitarist dropped his amplifier on the ground on the pavement and damaged it. The cone in the amplifier was destroyed. But it was the middle of the night. They had no way to get it fixed. They had no way to buy a new one, no place to borrow one because they had to get to Memphis. So they just got in the car and drove. They get to Sun Studios. They set up their equipment. And Sam Phillips says, "Okay, play me some of your songs." So they play some songs, and Sam's not that impressed. And he says, "Have you got anything else to play?" So they go, "Yeah, we have one song, but it's not really finished, but we'll play it for you anyway." So they play him this song called Rocket 88. And it's the first time the guitarist actually plugged into the amp, and the amp made this horrible noise. And Sam Phillips said, "What's that?" And they said, "Sorry, the amp, we dropped the amp is broken." He goes, "Play the song again." So they played the song again, and this guitar is making this weird noise coming out of the amp. And Sam Phillips says, "I love this song. This is fantastic. We're going to record this song." He said, "Yeah, but the amp is broken." He goes, "That's what I love most about it." because that's a sound I have never heard before. So they record the song with this broken amp, and Sam Phillips puts it out, issues the record, and it becomes a #1 record. And what's so interesting about that particular record is it has been heralded as the very first rock and roll record ever. So Sam Phillips is the man that's been credited with inventing rock and roll. But that song in 1950, now that predated Elvis by 4 years, right? Elvis didn't, I think, roll into his Sun Studios to late 53, 1954. So that song, made because that amp was broken, the mistake of dropping the amp on the ground, that sound infatuated Sam Phillips. That was why he recorded that song. And why he loved that sound so much was because it was a sound he had never heard before. And that is literally ground zero for rock and roll. So the man who invented rock and roll invented it because someone dropped an amp by mistake on the ground one night while racing to Memphis. The book has got 24 chapters in it, by the way. And some of the people I talk about are Scotty Bowman, made a huge mistake with Serge Savard's career, which you have to read because it's unbelievable. Ski-Doo, that brand name was supposed to be Ski Dog, except a big mistake was made in the typography. Billy Joel, just a fantastic story about Billy Joel trying to get his record royalties back from somebody that had really written a bad contract for him. And he ends up going to Los Angeles and playing incognito in a bar while he tries to figure out how to ambush this guy to get his money back. And while he's playing in this bar, because he made a mistake signing the contract. And he's playing in this bar, and doesn't he write his opus, Piano Man, in that bar? And the story about that is unbelievable. Anyway, Bill Maher, who made a huge mistake in his career, lost his show. The Dixie Chicks is a great story about how, of course, they said what they said about being embarrassed that President Bush was from Texas, and then they lost their entire careers. Steve Jobs, Rob Lowe, with his sex tape came out and he lost his career, and then comedy was his savior. How Popsicles was a mistake. How Mario Puzo, I'm a Godfather fanatic, so Mario Puzo is a great story in there about him needing money really quickly because he had borrowed money from loan sharks and they were going to break his arm. And he needed quick money, so he slapdashed a very quick story that he had no faith in called The Godfather. And he did it just for fast cash. And of course, the rest is history. Anyway, the book is all about people who make really huge mistakes, but it ends up being the best thing that ever happened to them. And I think when I think back on all those stories, which are so different, Hollywood, sports, singers, entrepreneurs, the thing that connects them, I think, the connective tissue, is that someone along the way made a small, insignificant mistake, but they all realized they were stuck with it, as I was saying earlier. But nobody ran from the problem. Not one person in this book ran from the problem or said that's it and then disappeared into the ether. They all chose to muscle through the problem. And I learned this over and over again in my career too, by the way, which is to say, embrace the obstacle. Instead of trying to run from it or change it or embrace the obstacle, in other words, embrace the mistake, no matter how big, because I realized in my career, the solution to a huge mistake is sitting at the heart of the mistake. In other words, you have to peel the mistake like a banana, because sitting patiently in the center of that mistake, of that error, of that catastrophic thing is the solution, is the opportunity. So when you find that, if you have the courage to peel that mistake like a banana, you'll find a meaningful opportunity in the middle of it. Most people will not do that. They will not make that effort to find that beautiful opportunity in the center. And I think that is, in the end, the nugget of this book. And I say here, When an epic mistake feels like it might be career-ending or debilitating or humiliating, when you feel like you may have lost your credibility, your livelihood, or even your sanity, it might just be destiny preparing you for what you've asked for all along. Just remember to ask one question: what is the hidden gift? So that's the book in a nutshell.
I'm going to join Terry now to ask some questions, some that have been sent in from you at home and some that will be taken from our live audience. The first one is, Terry, be honest, what is your best mistake?
That's well, you know, can I read you the dedication in this book? I think that'll answer it all, actually. The dedication says, dedicated to the worst boss I ever had, who taught me the best lesson, how not to do it. So early in my career, I had a boss that was not good. And I learned at his feet how not to run a creative company. He hated everything I did. He would turn down every piece of creative that I generated. I said, I think he even booed my car in the parking lot. And for 2 years, I hated it at the time. Like I stayed there for 2 years, too long. I hated it at the time. I had to drag my caboose into work every morning. But I have to tell you something, in having started a company many years later and being an entrepreneur for most of my life, the lessons I learned in that 2-year stop were amazing to me, because I learned how not to do it. I learned how to treat creative staff properly, how to be a cheerleader at your company, how to be positive, how to give clients really great work that means something, to be worried about your client's business, like none of the things he did. So it was a huge learning. It felt like the worst mistake of my career at the time, but in hindsight, it was probably the best set of endless lessons that I could have taken with me along the way.
Okay, here's another one related to mistakes. How do you recognize a mistake as an opportunity? Or are all mistakes opportunities?
That's a good question. It's probably a case-by-case basis. It's hard to just have one sweeping answer to that, but I will say this. As it may seem like a small mistake at first, or it may seem like a big mistake immediately, but if it's a big mistake or a small mistake that grows into a huge issue, that's the kind of mistake I'm talking about. That at the heart of that, as it grows, as it becomes exponentially huge and you start to fret and worry, that at the heart of that kind of mistake is an opportunity. And you just have to really roll up your sleeves, roll with it, and then look for the opportunity that's hidden in the center of it.
Okay, let's change tack for a second here. Is Alec Baldwin really a jerk?
Oh. Well, I have to say I enjoyed working with him. It was interesting, his whole vibe is kind of laid back in a way. Like, he can be intense, but if you ever see him interviewed, he's very composed, he's very smart, he's got a podcast where he's very erudite in it. But when I worked with him, he was frantic. It was kind of jarring. And that's the thing about celebrities. They're never what you think they are, because you only know their persona. For example, I worked with Gilbert Gottfried, and you may know Gilbert. I worked with Howie Mandel. They're both kind of like very, how would I describe their humor? It's like a lot of energy, right? Gilbert was the shyest person I've ever worked with. He was so shy, I can't believe he's in show business. And Howie Mandel was the same thing. Like, there couldn't be a more quiet human being than Howie Mandel. I tell this story in the book too. I was doing a big campaign for Labatt Brewery, and at that time, beer brands in this country were the most active advertisers. So it was very hard to find actors for their commercials, because if you've done a Molson commercial, you can't do a Labatt commercial at the same time. It's called a conflict. So it got very hard to find great actors when I needed them for this particular campaign. So I said to the client, let's go record it in Los Angeles, because there's a great talent pool in Hollywood, and it doesn't matter what beer they've done down there, because there weren't many conflicts up here. So I cast all these actors for this big campaign. And I needed a very specific young actress for one of the roles. She had to sound like she was in her mid-20s, and I needed somebody who was really funny. So I briefed a casting company in Los Angeles to audition, and then they sent me up the auditions, about 150 actors reading for about 5 to 7 roles. And, I picked out, people I thought would be good. And then this actress reads the lines, and they are hilarious. She nails every single line. And she had really short lines. She didn't have a lot to work with, but she just nailed it. And I thought, wow, what a find she is. So I presented her to the client and to Labatt, and everybody loved her. And we go down to Los Angeles, and I've got her in a room full of really seasoned actors, because the actors I love to hire down there were all the second bananas from sitcoms, because they were so good and so professional and so funny. But she was new, and I could tell that they all knew each other, but she didn't know anybody. So she would always just kind of hover in the corner, and then she'd walk up to the mic and say her lines. Hilarious. The seasoned actors in the room would be stifling laughs because she was so good. Then she would recede into the shadows again and wait in the corner. And that actress was Ellen DeGeneres. She was a star before she was a star. And so they're never quite what you think they are. But I did love working with Ellen.
Go ahead. Okay, here's another question, and it doesn't relate to the book, but it relates to your podcasting experience. In the age of constant video content, why do you think podcasts have become so popular? Are they the rebirth of radio?
Yes, they are. I really do think it is the rebirth of radio. It's an interesting thing. When the internet landed, my audio company was kind of stranded because nobody wanted audio for the internet. Like, what's the first thing you did on a website, even probably to this day, if there's sounds, you go for the mute button, right? Nobody wanted to hear sound online. So my company struggled to try and find a place to exist in an internet digital world. And then suddenly podcasts slowly became like, we're pioneer podcasters, by the way. We have been podcasting now for, what is it, Deb, 11 or 12 years now? Like, there were very few podcasts when we started podcasting. But it fit my skill set because I really spent my career in audio, in studios, and creating sound effects and music and storytelling. So the podcast as a medium was right up my alley. So that was great for me. Suddenly I could apply my skill set to the digital realm, if you follow me. And I think it was radio on demand, just like Netflix. I think it just became, the zeitgeist was just this thing where you didn't have to sit in front of a radio at 11:30 on Thursday morning to hear our radio show. You could actually be sitting in the bathtub at midnight listening to our radio show because a podcast is on demand. And I think that on-demand quality of a podcast was right for the time.
Terry, we have time for one more question. I think it's a really great one. The question is, thinking about mistakes, even best ones, do you think that today's society is more or less forgiving and judgmental?
Well, there's cancel culture, which, in a lot of cases, people make mistakes and don't get a chance to kind of have a Lazarus-like rebirth. I think, again, it's a case-by-case basis. It depends on what the mistake is and where you make it and what it is, et cetera. But I do think it's tougher probably to bounce back from mistakes in this current climate. It is daunting for a lot of people, I think.
Before we stop, let's just ask if our in-house audience has any questions that they'd like to pose to Terry.
What are you thinking?
What are you thinking, people? Anything? Oh, okay. Somebody wants to know. Has the advertising business changed because of streaming services like Netflix?
Yes. So it's very difficult to get noticed as a brand now, even though you have more channels, like, you have Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest, et cetera. You've also got, big channels like Netflix with no advertising that people are spending a lot of time on. So a lot of people are, cutting their cables and only having Netflix. So there's, a lot of television advertising can't get through to them. But there's been this migration of television to YouTube, where suddenly advertisers are not limited to 30 seconds anymore. so they can do 2-minute ads and still have the same filmic qualities and the same scale and the same quality of film. So I really think television is not ineffective, it's just inefficient, right? So the great thing about these channels like Twitter, et cetera, is you can really hone in on a specific audience. So there's more channels, but it's still harder to get noticed. And mostly because social media is not really a selling space. It's a social space, hence social media. So you really have to create a conversation with your audience and then sell. If you follow our feeds for our Apostrophe or Apostrophe Podcast Company or Under the Influence, you'll notice instantly that we are constantly having a conversation with our listeners all the time. They're sending me episode ideas. They're like, hey, Terry, I saw this campaign in Germany recently. I don't know if you've seen it. Here it is. And they'll send it to me. And I would not have seen it if they had not sent it to me. And suddenly I've got a great story for an episode. They'll comment on the work we do. We'll go back and forth. We'll even disagree on things, but it's this constant conversation so that when I have a book to sell, then they don't mind that I do a little selling because 98% of the time, we're just having a great conversation. So if you're only selling on social, people are going to unfollow you. But if you're having a genuine relationship with your customers, your clients, or your listeners, then they will be more than willing to accept when it is time for you to sell your wares.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. That's been fascinating. I'm going to take over the camera for a minute
Okay,
now. So I'll let you get up and I'll sit down. Hi again, everyone. I'll keep this short. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much, Terry, for entertaining and enlightening us. We all make mistakes. We had a few here tonight. We had an internet outage, and I apologize for that, but we got back online, I think, for most of the evening. If there are any questions that you have because you missed a few minutes of audio, you can tweet to Terry or maybe follow him on Instagram or send him a note on Facebook. He's more than happy, I'm sure, to take your questions. So as I said, we all make mistakes, but asking Terry to speak tonight at NLC was not one of them. Thank you to our Zoom audience for being with us this evening. Your loyalty and support keep us motivated to bring you great programs, like the mini-series on climate change that will run November 11th, 18th, and 25th with some stellar presenters, including Young Wu, the CEO of Mars Discovery District, and Diana Fox-Carney, an expert on international climate change policy. You'll be getting an email about that very soon, so please continue to support us. Before we go, can you take a couple of seconds to answer the survey that will pop up on your screen? And thank you once again, and good night, everyone.